محمد.
برای خوشنودی محمد و آل محمد صلوات.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Let's begin tonight's discussion remembering those who have gone before us. Let's recite a Fatiha for all of the Shahada, for all of the rightful scholars that have passed away, especially our dear beloved Shaheed al-Qa'id, for all of your marhumin, and for all those who have no one to recite a Fatiha for them. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. For the hastening of the reappearance of our beloved Imam, please recite a loud salawat. So that we may be among his true companions, his true followers, and his true lovers, please recite the second one the louder. And as an invitation to the beloved Imam of our time and the Shuhada to this gathering of ours, please recite the third one the loudest. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب قلوبنا شفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين روحي وأرواح العالمين لتراب مقدمه الفداء. قال سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا فتحنا لك فتحا مبينا صدق الله العلي العظيم. Please recite another loud salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
Once again, first and foremostly, we thank Allah for giving us the opportunity to continue with our discussions and be a part of these blessed gatherings. As mentioned yesterday as well, these are gatherings which should not be taken for granted, and especially when it comes to the first beginning moments of these programs, it's important to remind ourselves of this blessing we have received, that we should be thankful for as much as possible. And the most beautiful way to be thankful for this opportunity is to make sure that these gatherings and the feelings they bring, they continue beyond just the time that we spend together over here. Our series is titled The Path to Victory, Karbala through the lens of Surah Fath. And we very briefly touched upon this discussion yesterday, and inshallah today we'll look to expand on it further. Our beloved Shaheed al-Qa'id, before his Shahada and after the wars and the difficulties had started, he had requested, or he had given 3 advices to the people for the victory of the front of Haqq. The first advice was he asked the people to recite Dua number 14 from Sahifa Sajjadiyah for the people at the war fronts. The second advice he gave was to recite Dua Tawassul, and the third advice he had given was the recitation of Surah Fath. Reciting these as individuals is good, Reciting these as individuals regularly is even better, but reciting these as a collective on a regular basis is the ideal. And we need to understand that when our scholars ask us or give us this advice, it's not just so we can attain the spiritual benefits. So the spiritual benefits of the 14th Dua of Sahifa Sajjadiyah, or the spiritual benefits of Dua Tawassul, or the spiritual benefits of Surah Fath. The reason why they advise us these texts is because within it are lessons which are absolutely essential for us to learn in order to attain that victory, in order to attain those divine objectives. Now think about this. You begin reciting it as an individual, then regularly, then as a collective, regularly on one side, and then reciting it after understanding the lessons that exist within it, especially for the time you are in, on another side. It is so incredibly important for us to take these lessons into consideration. Which is why we have gone on the journey that we have. If our beloved Shaheed al-Qa'id said that he advised that we should be reciting these, we want to understand why. And ulama across the board, when this advice was given across the board, they began holding classes and sessions explaining that dua, explaining the secrets hidden within Dua Tawassul, and also classes of tafsir regarding Surah Fath. And as you see, the nights that we have in front of us, as we progress through this blessed chapter of the Holy Quran, you will begin to see the reason and the value behind that advice. And this isn't just advice for those who are in the thick of it, those who are over there in the war front. On the contrary, those who are there doing their responsibilities and duties, they know what they have to do, and they're busy carrying that on. This is for all those lovers of the Ahlul Bayt across the world whose hearts are with the front of Haqq, but they just don't know what we can do. What are the steps we can take? How can we help? Well, let's not underestimate the power that exists within these du'as, within this chapter. So incredibly important that we don't just see these as ritualistic recitations. The reality of these texts is that they become the shields and the weapons that are needed by those who are active. We should not underestimate this at all. And inshallah, as I said, in the future nights we'll mention some of those points as well. We mentioned yesterday that the main philosophy, the main point behind Surah Fath was what? The main point was this: Fath, meaning victory or opening, as we look into it, is not something that is decided by you or I. Fath is what Allah considers to be a victory. Why do I state this? Because Fathul Mubin was the name given for an event which in the apparent looked like a retreat, looked like a defeat. The Sulh of Hudaybiyah. In the apparent, that's what it looked like. But what we will see today is, despite what the apparent looked like, Allah declared this Fathul Mubin. That's the most important lesson that we want to gain out of this. Our calculations and our yardsticks, hopefully by the end of these nights together, we will put that aside. And we will begin to understand the yardsticks and the laws that Allah has, the traditions, the divine tradition, Sunan-e-Ilahi, right? The divine traditions that exist, and they become the primary element which we use to decide what we will do in our lives. That's the point of these nights. Otherwise, we mention Karbala is the biggest example of what the enemies consider and considered to be victory. They considered it to be a victory. But we all know that it was not a victory for them. We all know in reality it's one of the greatest victories that Islam has attained in its history. It's a victory which, as mentioned yesterday, led to the creation of a fire within the mu'mineen that will never be cooled. It will remain till the end of days. But it's one thing saying that, it's another thing understanding how is it that Allah calculates that to be a victory, whilst we in our calculations may not necessarily feel that. I want to stress that. We may not necessarily feel that. We may see it and understand it on a superficial level. But do we really feel that? Why do I say this? There are different instances in history which when you look back to now, you're like, of course I would stand on this side and not on that side. Hudaybiyah could have been one of them. We may have seen it as, hang on a second, what are we doing over here? Why are we giving so much ground? And we're going to go into the details of exactly what happened. Another instance, we know this. The Muhanada, the ceasefire between Muawiyah and our second Imam, Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba alayhi salam.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa'ajjil farajahum.
To express the love that you have in your heart for our beloved second Imam, please recite aloud a salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa'ajjil farajahum.
It's so important to remember that those who went against the Imam at that time, our second Imam, were not those who were in the ranks of the enemy. They were those who were around him. They were those who were around him, who saw what happened as a humiliation. They saw it as an apparent loss. So, who is to say, if we were there at that time, we would also be fine? Well, I don't know. Do you live your lives in a way that is governed by divine calculations? Or do you live your lives the same manner as those who do not have Allah, those who do not have the Quran, those who do not have the Ahlul Bayt? I mentioned this for a different reason last year. If you speak to people in our community, you'll have Hassan, Hussein, Ali, and you ask them, what are your aspirations in life? What do you consider to be success? And they say, I want to have a sound job. I want to have a happy family. I want to have a house, a shelter to live in. These are all noble. No one is saying don't do these things. That's fine. But then when I speak to Tom, Richard, and Harry, and I say to them, what would you consider to be success? And they say, I want to have a sound job. I want to have shelter for my family. I want to have a happy family. You really have to question, hang on a second. The person who has the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt considers success to be exactly the same thing as someone who does not have those things. I mean, the world has changed a lot, so Tom, Richard, and Harry may actually be Muslim as well, but But you get the point, right? Which yardsticks govern our lives right now? Because if we genuinely look into our lives and reach the conclusion that, hang on a second, forget using the divine yardsticks to judge what is success and progress. I don't even know what the divine yardsticks are. I don't know what differentiates the way I make my decisions to the way that someone who does not have the Quran and Ahlul Bayt makes their decisions. That's a very scary position to be in. Again, over these few nights, inshallah, we will become closer to understanding what these are, and hopefully our decisions will be more rooted in the love that each and every single one of us has for the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. Please recite salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil
I want to bring it more, I want to make it more personal, bring it more to our direct situation. Why is this discussion important for us? Why do I need to know what Allah considers to be victory? And isn't this a matter for government? Is this not a matter for the battlefields? What's it got to do with our lives over here? The situation that we find ourselves in as Muslims living in the UK specifically, where we are in a society in which the forces are pushing the hearts and minds of ourselves and our children away from the divine. Is that not a battlefield? Is that not a challenge? Do we consider the fight between the front of Haqq and the front of Batil to be purely what is done in the East, but when it comes to us, when it comes to the plans of Shaitan, it doesn't apply over here? Remember, governments and countries and armies and all of these things are just tools in the hands of Shaitan. In the battlefield that exists in the UK, for example, it's not about military, it's not about weapons, it's none of that. It's got nothing to do with us. But Shaitan will use different tools over here. And we know this in the community that we live in the society that we live in. Millions are spent, if not billions, definitely. Billions are spent in manufacturing an environment around us that pushes us away from the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. And subhanAllah, as a side note, one thing that will always get in their way is, no matter how the year has been spent, when it comes to the first 10 days of Muharram, there's these people in our community who detach themselves from this dunya and go towards Sayyid al-Shuhada. Every time Muharram comes, the billions they spend trying to buy our hearts and minds gets wasted. That's the blessing of this Farsha Azhar. Obviously, we have to then take the steps to take this Farsha Azhar into our hearts and then into our lives outside. But why is this discussion important for us? Because if we just look at the apparent calculations, look at the numbers they have, look at the money they have, look at the resources they have, if that is the only thing you see, then of course, if the apparent is the only thing that you see, then you would be worried. You won't be able to see victory. Because you will think, and they have convinced you to think, these are the things that matter. That's why I believe it's incredibly important for us to have these discussions so we understand, again, according to the divine, what actually matters, what actually gets you there. Another important reason to have these discussions, linking it to Karbala, is at the time of the ceasefire between Muawiyah and our second Imam, when some of the Muslims began to argue with the second Imam, he was reduced to only, at that moment, because of the sensitivity of the situation, give one response. He said, look at the Sulh of Hudaybiyah. The second Imam referred to the Sulh of Hudaybiyah. Why is that significant for us? Because to understand Karbala, you need to understand the journey between the ceasefire that was signed and the 20 years of the Imamat of Sayyid al-Shuhada before Karbala. So you had 10 years during the time of Muawiyah, and then you had the 10 years at the time of Yazid. It's not like as soon as Yazid came in, that's it. It was war. No, there was a journey that they went on. If we want to truly understand Karbala, we need to understand the ceasefire between the second Imam and Muawiyah. And if we want to understand that, we need to truly understand the Sulh of Hudaybiyah. And I touched upon this before. Just keep this in, I was going to say the back of your minds, but please keep it in the front of your minds. The reason why it's important to have these discussions is because we need to understand why there were some people who went against these decisions. What were the traits that existed within them? We need to make sure we don't have those traits. Who were the ones who stood firm throughout these tests? What were the traits that existed within them? And how can we be like them? It's important for me to mention the benefits of these discussions. Something we can keep going back to. Okay, why are we doing this? Because someone may say, well, we're looking at a chapter of history. What does that have to do with the 10 days of Muharram? So just keep this in mind. This is why it's important for us to have these discussions. So what was the background of the Sulh of Hudaybiyah? Before Hudaybiyah, the Muslims had already had significant advances and victories. The migration itself from Mecca to Medina was not a small event. It was against all odds that migration took place. The fact that the Muslims had survived until then in itself was a victory. Then the migration itself was another victory. But the Quran did not describe those events as a fath. The building of the Islamic government in Medina, again, that's not a small task. You can take over a land, but actually set in the structure that is needed to protect it and then to strengthen it, with all of the tests which exist, the threat from the Persian Empire, the threat from the Roman Empire, that in itself was a big victory. After that, you had Badr, you had Uhud, you had Khandaq. None of these, as I mentioned yesterday, none of these were introduced as a fath, let alone Fathul Mubin, right? A clear opening, a clear victory. However, until this point, the power of the Muslims was still not considered to be solidified. especially in the eyes of the enemy, they still felt that they had a chance. Ahzab was a massive blow. Ahzab was a massive blow because, as you know, the battle of the parties, it's known as. Why? Because the Quraysh didn't go alone to fight against the Muslims. They teamed up with all of the other groups who also wanted to get rid of Islam. That was a massive blow, but despite that, this power of the Muslims was still not solidified. Think about it. Mecca was still in the hands of the Quraysh. In that region, the most important city was Mecca. We know the history of the pilgrimage to Mecca. It wasn't just at the time of Islam that this happened. For centuries, communities used to visit. It became a very important trading port. It became the bazaar over there is what gave Quraysh their power. It was not a small area. It was a very powerful area. It was still in the hands of the Quraysh. The Muslims were still just treated as this disruptive opposition. Right? This community is annoying. We need to get rid of them before they become more annoying. But they were treated as look, we are the power and they're this thorn that we have on our sides. That's how they were treated. So before Hudaybiyah, Islam had survived, right? But it had not become deep rooted, despite the victories, despite the government in Medina. So you have all those, I would say, smaller advancements and smaller victories, but that victory, that moment which establishes you as an entity had not occurred yet. Now you would think that if battles are not able to do that for you, if the establishment of a government is not able to do that for you, then what is? Again, this depends. Which lens are you looking at it from? Are you looking at it from the apparent lens or not? I'm going to say this in brackets. A lot of this you will now understand so much better because of the current situation of the world. Close brackets. I'll leave it at that. But you know exactly what I'm talking about. So as we go through these, think about the situation that we are in currently and how you can see reflections of it. So in the 6th year after Hijrah, the beloved messenger saw a dream. In this dream, he saw himself and the believers entering Mecca, carrying out the pilgrimage, and their heads were shaved at the end of it. And this was the dream which became the basis of why this pilgrimage was started. So around 1,400 Muslims set out from Medina. Remember, at this point, Mecca is not in their hands. It's in the hands of those that they have had battles with. But at the same time, ultimately, they have to let people come for pilgrimage. They can't say no. However, the Prophet laid down some very strict conditions for the Muslims. They were not marching as an army. This wasn't a military deployment. They were going for pilgrimage. They were ordered to leave behind any weapons. So they weren't allowed to take any weapons with them. Now when we say weapons, we're talking about weapons that are beyond just personal protection. Because in that time, if you told someone you can't take your sword, for example, that's like a piece of their clothing. Right? So we're not talking about that. We're talking about weapons which were known to be weapons of war. They weren't allowed to take those. They weren't allowed to take any of their camels or horses that were known as what you can use in war, essentially. As you know, like in that culture in those days, they had a camel and a horse for everything. But they were very specific. They knew exactly which camels were to be used for what. They knew exactly which horses to be used for what. On top of this, they were only asked to carry rations which can get you to Mecca, and that's it. Why? Because when you would normally go to pilgrimage to Mecca, that's what you would do. You would carry the amount of rations that will get you there. Because once you reach there, you can buy whatever you need to get back. But what message does this give? Those rations are not enough to lay siege. Those rations are not enough to go for battle. Those are enough for you to just reach there. That's it. And on top of this, what made them less mobile? As an army, you want to be mobile. You want to be able to move without having too many considerations that are beyond the military kind of elements. On top of this, they were all asked to bring a sacrificial animal. So, not only are you going there and you cannot fight, these animals you're going to bring with you are not going to let you fight, because you need to make sure you're taking care of them, you need to make sure they don't run away. But all of these are messages being sent to the Quraysh: we are not here to fight. That's generally the side which is highlighted. However, the side that is not highlighted is think about the poor Muslims. What are they thinking? You want us to go to the heart of the enemy with no weapons, with no war animals, with just enough rations for us to reach there, with these animals that we're going to use for sacrifice. Think about the mindset of the Muslims at this time. These are tests which are in place by Allah to see who is a real mu'min and who is not. Why do I stress that? Because sometimes we think, oh, it's the apparent battle of Badr and Uhud and Khandaq and so on and so forth. It's those apparent battles which are a test. No. The test is this: will you do your responsibility and what is asked of you, no matter what the situation is? That is what matters. Unfortunately, what some of us may do is, yes, I want to do khidmah of the religion, but not how the religion wants me to do it, how I want to do it. So I enjoy giving lectures. So that is how I want to serve. It may be useful, but are you doing it because it's the duty which has been given down to you and you're submitting to it? Or are you doing it to fulfill the desires of your nafs? Same goes for those who may be reciting. I am willing to volunteer in the 10 days of Muharram, but you're not going to see me throughout the rest of the year. Who are we to dictate the terms of our service to Islam? And if we are conditioning, if we are placing conditions on our service to Islam, then we need to ask the question, are we actually serving Islam, or are we just trying to serve ourselves? It's a very important and valid question for us to ask. When Shaheed al-Qa'id did the analysis of the night of migration, the famous incident where you had Amir al-Mu'mineen sleeping in the bed of Rasulullah, he says that yes, the bravery of Amir al-Mu'mineen in that situation was one of his greatest fada'il that we can mention. However, he says there's a greater fadila in what Amir al-Mu'mineen did. What's the greater fadila? Amir al-Mu'mineen at that time, as we know, that there may be instances where for maslahah, the hikmah that Allah has, He does not give certain bits of information to even the ma'asumeen. To that extent. For example, what's the most obvious piece of information? When is the day of judgment, for example? There is a difference of opinion, I want to stress, within the scholars about this. But there are times when some information is not given, or some information is taken away, because there's a lesson that needs to be taught for the rest of us, not for those individuals. So he says that Amir al-Mu'mineen did not sleep peacefully on that bed because he knew nothing would happen to him and he would wake up and everything will be fine. The fadila in what Amir al-Mu'mineen did was because he did not, I wouldn't say did not know, but he did not care. Why? He slept peacefully because he was fulfilling his duty. He was fulfilling his responsibility. Okay. But that's not it. That's not it. Do you understand what Amir al-Mu'mineen has just done? They suffered in Mecca. He was at the forefront of the struggle that they had in Mecca. And then in Medina, they are about to attain a massive victory. The days of being prosecuted and tortured are about to end. The days of having your own government, where you don't have to be afraid of this faith that you have, are about to begin. The fadila of Amir al-Mu'mineen in that position was, he did not say, oh, I'm not going to do this because I want to witness that victory. His fadila was, he did this despite the possibility of not experiencing that victory. The fadila of Amir al-Mu'mineen was, I will do what is necessary. I will do what my duty is, not what I feel like doing. That's the lesson we need to take from that story. We have to do what our responsibility is, regardless of whether we like it or not. Of course, Allah has given us certain attractions, certain things that we are attracted to, and we are more inclined to doing those. Right? There's a reason why Allah has given us that feeling, and there's nothing wrong with that. But Allah has given you that feeling for the beginning of your journey. Okay, I will give you this inclination towards your mum and dad so that you enjoy serving them, for example. But ultimately, the responsibility of the parents is to develop the reason why our children are serving us into not because, you get an ice cream at the end of it, but because Allah is happy with you doing this. Because the Imam will be happy with you doing this. Because this builds the skills that you need to be of service to the Imam. That's what it needs to become. You exist to serve the Imam. That's what it needs to become. Otherwise, it will remain, I will do this because I can see how it benefits me. How far will this get us? Look back in history. How far did those individuals get who liked the Ahlul Bayt a lot, until it became uncomfortable. Let me rephrase that. Even when it became uncomfortable, they still liked them. But did they do what was necessary to help them in those times? No. That wasn't the case. So, the Muslims at that time, the Prophet had placed these conditions. The Muslims' first test, are you still going to go on this pilgrimage or not? Or do you only listen to the Prophet when it's in your comfort zone? That was the first test that they had. Now, Quraysh was obviously in a dilemma. They claimed to be the guardians of the Kaaba. They claimed to honor the pilgrims to the Kaaba. And they wanted to say that we are the protectors of the holy months, in which there will be no fighting anymore. Right? So that's who they saw themselves as. So what do? If they allow the Muslims to come, and the Muslims, these sworn enemies, they are able to come, do the pilgrimage, and leave, they were like, we will be seen as weak. We will be seen as weak. Like, you can't do anything to these guys. At the same time, they can't attack them either. Why? Because they are supposed to protect the pilgrims. So that will diminish the value that they have as well. So they're in this dilemma. This is the pressure that they faced by this movement of the Muslims. The reason why Quraysh accepted to negotiate was not because of their generosity. Was not because they felt bad for the Muslims and okay, let's negotiate now. We need to understand this. The reason why Quraysh accepted to negotiate was because of the fear that they had. Right? This is the reality on the ground of that situation. Doesn't matter what the media says. Doesn't matter what the news says. At that time, I'm sure there were ways that they were sending messengers left, right, and center to try and create a narrative. The reality of the ground at that time was that Quraysh was forced to negotiate because they were afraid. They were stuck. They were not sure what we should do. I'm going to open another bracket on the side there. We need to make sure we don't have husna dhan towards the enemies of Islam and su'al dhan towards the Muslims. What do I mean by that? When they do something, they're so sophisticated, they're so smart, they have plans. It must be because they are so strong. And it's out of their generosity that they're negotiating. But when it comes to the side of the Muslims, they have to negotiate because they're so weak right now. They have no choice. What else are they going to do? They've been fooled by the enemy again. It is so dangerous if we have husna dhan towards others and we have su'al dhan towards our own. This is exactly what happened at the time of Muawiyah. His propaganda was able to convince the people that I may be wrong, but I'm sophisticated. There are layers behind my decisions. And poor Imam Hassan alayhi salam, he's a simple-minded individual. He's busy in his worship. He's not that, na'udhu billah, clued up about politics. So then whenever Muawiyah did something, everyone was like, oh, there must be some thinking and depth behind it. Whenever the Imam did something, he's being simple-minded. It is so dangerous for us to fall into that trap. Over here, now it's easy. We look back at history. Being made clear that the reason why Quraysh wanted to negotiate is not because they felt bad and they were being generous. It's because they were afraid. And the Muslims, the moves that they made were not rash, miscalculated, being simple. No, they were very calculated steps. Very calculated steps. What the Prophet did at that time forced the enemy, who in the apparent still had so much power, into such a situation. Please recite a salawat. So the negotiations began. A companion was sent to the Quraysh. Rumor spread that he had been killed. And at this point, the Prophet took bay'ah. We're going to go into details of all of specifically the bay'ah afterwards. Why was it important for the Prophet to take bay'ah here? Because we mentioned the list of things that the Muslims were already worried about. Now they've heard that the person that they sent may be killed. So the Prophet asked the Muslims to make bay'ah. We're going to, as I said, we're going to go into details of that afterward. And this is verse number, for those who want to look ahead, verse number 10 of Surah Fath speaks about this bay'ah. What were the terms? And I'm going to leave the discussion over here. These were the main terms of the treaty. Number one, the Muslims would return to Medina that year without entering Mecca. Number two, the following year, they would be allowed to return and perform the Hajj. Number three, there would be a period of peace between the Muslims and Quraysh. Now, very briefly, these first three conditions. From the Muslims' perspective, for those who could only see the apparent, not the mu'min's perspective, I want to stress, the Muslims' perspective, this is humiliation. We've traveled all this way. There's 1,400 of us. Why do we have to turn back? Why should there be a period of peace right now? We have power. We won the previous battles. Why do we need to have a year of peace? Number four, if someone from Mecca became Muslim and fled to Medina, the Prophet would return them. Think about those people who are upset at this treaty, right? They see this clause. Someone becomes a Muslim in Mecca, comes to Medina, we have to send them back. And to make it even worse in the apparent, if someone from Medina defected to Quraysh, Quraysh would not be required to send them back. Every clause of this they had an issue with. Every single clause of this there. And in the apparent, it looks unequal. But what are these nights about? What are we here to discuss? We're here to discuss that apparent calculations are not what matter. There is a divine system in place which we want to understand. So to many of the companions, this looked like capitulation. What have you done? On top of this, when the treaty was being signed, you will have heard this. They wrote, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. They said, if we accepted your Rahman, we would not need a treaty. So, they had to remove that. And they just said, Bismika Allahumma, that's it. Then began with Muhammad Rasulullah. Please recite salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Again, they said, we don't accept you as the messenger of Allah. If we did, we wouldn't need this treaty. So they had to remove this. Then the famous incident, Amir al-Mu'mineen was a scribe. Out of respect of the Prophet, he says, I cannot remove this name. So the Prophet himself then removed it. So think about the clauses. Then think about this is happening as well. And the Muslims there were like, we don't understand. Why are we giving so much room? We don't praise those Muslims right now who stood against the Prophet. We'll analyze how these clauses were in fact all things which helped attain victory. We'll analyze this further tomorrow. But I want you to understand the reason why this verse was revealed was because of the way Rasulullah was treated by those Muslims who only looked at the world through apparent calculations. They could not see the divine system. They could not see the divine calculations. They just looked at the apparent. Again, through understanding how those clauses were actually points of victory for the Muslims, we will begin to get a feel of what the divine system is. And we'll go into some of those divine laws in a lot more detail afterwards. If you understood that, if you understood what happened at Hudaybiyah, you would have understood why the second Imam signed the ceasefire. And you would also understand why Sayyid al-Shuhada carried out that sacrifice on the day of Ashura. We have to understand this chain. And in all of this journey, again, I want to stress, what's the point? We want to know where we will be in that journey, where we stand right now. I'm just going to mention one narration regarding the month of Muharram. Imam Jaffri Sadiq alayhi salam, one of his companions asked him, my master, may I be sacrificed for you? So you can tell this is an individual who knows the Imam, loves the Imam. When someone dies or is killed, people hold a mourning gathering for him. But I see that you and your Shia begin holding mourning gatherings from the first day of Muharram every year. The Imam replied, what kind of a statement is this? And then he said this narration. Now I want to stress, what is in this narration, I'm not claiming that we understand it. Inshallah, the ulama can decipher this further for us. But at the very least, we understand the importance of these days. And we begin to understand why there is a sadness that is in our hearts. And why tears come so easily in our eyes. Sometimes we begin to think it's because of the black we put around the walls. And it's because of wearing the black shirt. All of these external factors. That's there, but understand there is something that exists within us that creates this grief and these tears. What does the Imam say? When the crescent of Muharram appears, the angels display the shirt of Sayyid al-Shuhada. Which state is this shirt in? It is torn by the blows of the swords and drenched in blood. We and our Shia see it with our basira, not with our eyes. And when we see this, what happens? Our tears burst forth. He says, we and the Shia each and every single one of us. There are other narrations which stress this point. For example, Amir al-Mu'mineen said directly to Sayyid al-Shuhada, Ya abrata kulli mu'min, you are the cause, or O cause of the tears of every mu'min. I'm about to say something slightly harsh, but I'm saying this to myself before anyone else. If when the month of Muharram begins, this is the state of the mu'mineen, and I don't find myself in that state at the beginning of the month, I should not be too confident about this mu'minness that I claim to have. These narrations are very frank. This does not mean you start going around judging other people. You don't know how much someone has cried at home before they came here. You don't know how much someone has cried when they were listening to some Masayib or a Noha in the car, when no one else was watching. I mean this for ourselves, to look inside and think about this. The shirt goes up, cut, drenched in blood. We become upset. Think about the state of the heart of the Imam of the time at the beginning of this month, when he has to see that shirt. And as I mentioned yesterday, Karbala is in front of him. We just hear about it. He sees Karbala in front of him. He sees all of the tragedies that happen from beginning to the end, every single year at this time. So when we do listen to the Masa'ib today, when we are shedding those tears, please keep in mind the wounded and bloodied heart of the Imam of our time as well. We cannot be negligent of the true host of these majalis. Inshallah, we pray that these tears and these discussions that we are having are accepted in the courtyard of our beloved Imam, and we pray that these tears and steps are all accepted as the preconditions for the return, the hastening of the return of our beloved Imam, with the barakah of a loud salawat.
नाराए तकबीर, नाराए रिसालत, नाराए हैदरी, हुसैनियत, यजीदियत, बर मोहम्मद व आले मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु मुमिनीन। बिला ताखीर मैं दरख्वास्त करूँगा जनाब मौलाना मकबूल हुसैन अलवी साहब से कि वो तशरीफ़ ले आएँ और आपकी मौजूद सदा से खिताब फरमाएँ। बर मोहम्मद व आले मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम।